Hello, welcome to Midweek Bible Video. We'll be doing the normal things, continuing in our series on Romans at the end. But first, let's do our Catechism question. Question 11 from the New City Catechism asks, what does God require in the 6th, 7th and 8th commandments? 6th, that we do not hurt, hate or be hostile to our neighbour, but be patient and peaceful. 7th, pursuing even our enemies with love. 7th, that we abstain from sexual immorality and live purely and faithfully, whether in marriage or in single life, avoiding all impure actions, looks, words, thoughts or desires, and whatever might lead to them. 8th, that we do not take without permission that which belongs to someone else, nor withhold any good from someone we might benefit. The text this refers to, obviously, is the commandments about adultery, murder and theft. And you can see Paul sums up as Jesus sums up, and as it's summed up elsewhere in the New Testament. This is essentially, you shall love your neighbour as yourself, which is how Leviticus puts it too, which Jesus uses as a reference point when he sums up the greatest commandments. I thought one quick thing I'll just flick across to is the kind of commentary text that's included here, which just the very start I thought was a very good start from Martin Lloyd-Jones. Man cannot even keep the 10 commandments, and yet he talks glibly about keeping the Sermon on the Mount and of imitating Christ. And if a man cannot keep the 10 commandments as they understand them, what hope have they of keeping the 10 commandments as they've been interpreted by the Lord Jesus Christ? So that's one thing that definitely comes out as we read through these, is we should always remember, especially as it's stated here, if we are attempting to keep the 10 commandments and that were the way to life, if that was all we had to do, if we were to take Jesus' standard that heart crime is sin as well, heart sin is real sin, then we correctly despair. And we'll touch on some of that today in Romans and in future sessions in Romans. But particularly here, the thing to note about these commandments that the Catechism is drawing out is, again, they're framed positively. So in question 9, the first, second and third is, rather than simply talking about we shouldn't serve any gods other than God, we should think, well, that means we should serve God, we should know and trust God. Second, we avoid all idolatry, we don't worship God improperly. Third, we treat God's name with fear and reverence, honouring also his word and works. And again, it does the same in the 4th and 5th commandments. We should use the Sabbath to serve the Lord and others, anticipate the eternal Sabbath. 5th, we love and honour our mother and father, submitting to their godly discipline and direction. And now, it's not just that you don't murder, it's that the implication of that, the positive implication, is that you should not just not hurt, hate or be hostile. So it's not just don't murder, but also don't be hostile or hate or hurt, but instead be patient and peaceful, pursuing even our enemies with love. And the same for the 7th and 8th commandments. God isn't simply offering restrictions. These restrictions are summaries of a good as well as a privation, as well as a removal of what we can do. They're an implication of what we ought to do. And Jesus draws at that point again and again. Not murdering people means loving your neighbour as yourself. Both Leviticus and Jesus say. Which means that not murdering doesn't just mean don't stab them, it means help them flourish in their life. Which has political implications, of course. Question 12, which we'll do next week, is the final 2 commandments. What does God require in the 9th and 10th commandments? 9th, that we do not lie or deceive, but speak the truth in love. 10th, that we are content, not envying anyone or resenting what God has given them or us. So now we are in All Things for Good by Thomas Watson. We are in chapter 3, section 2. Inferences from the proposition that all things work for the good of the saints. So the chapter is why all things work for good. Watson has spent the last 2 chapters demonstrating that good things work for good to godly people and evil things work for good to godly people. All based on the verse, all things work for good to them that love God and are called according to his purpose. So Watson is now saying, okay, so we've demonstrated that it happens, but why? And he said initially, the grand reason why all things work for good, which is that God is our God, which has all these other implications. Now, inferences from the proposition that all things work for the good of the saints. 1. If all things work for good, hence learn that there is a providence. Things do not work of themselves, but God sets them working for good. God is the great disposer of all events and issues. He sets everything working. His kingdom ruleth over all, Psalm 103:19. It is meant of his providential kingdom. Things in the world are not governed by second causes, by the counsels of men, by the stars and planets, but by divine providence. Providence is the queen and governess of the world. There are 3 things in providence: God's foreknowing, God's determining, and God's directing all things to their periods and events. Whatever things do work in the world, God sets them a-working. We read in the first of Ezekiel of wheels and eyes in the wheels and the moving of the wheels. The wheels are the whole universe. The eyes and the wheels are God's providence. The moving of the wheel is the hand of providence, turning all things here below. That which is by some called chance is nothing else but the result of providence. Learn to adore providence. Providence has an influence upon all things here below. It is this that mingles the ingredients and makes up the whole compound. 2. Observe the happy condition of every child of God. All things work for good, his good, the best and the worst things. Unto the upright ariseth light in darkness, Psalm 112:4. The most dark, cloudy providences of God have some sunshine in them. What a blessed condition is a true believer in. When he dies, he goes to God, and while he lives, everything shall do him good. Affliction is for his good. What hurt does the fire to the gold? It only purifies it. What hurt does the fan to the corn? It only separates the chaff from it. What hurt do leeches to the body? They only suck out the bad blood. God never uses his staff but to beat out the dust. Affliction does that which the word many times will not. It opens the ear to discipline. Job 36:10. When God lays men upon their backs, then they look up to heaven. God smiting his people is like the musician striking upon the violin, which makes it put forth a melodious sound. How much good comes to the saints by affliction! When they are pounded and broken, they send forth their sweetest smell. Which adds here, they are like bruised flowers. My text doesn't have that, but yeah, that makes the image make sense. Anyway, continuing. Affliction is a bitter root, but it bears sweet fruit. It yieldeth the peaceable fruit of righteousness, Hebrews 12:11. Affliction is the highway to heaven. Though it be flinty and thorny, yet it is the best way. Poverty shall starve our sins. Sickness shall make grace more helpful, 2 Corinthians 4:16. Reproach shall cause the Spirit of God and of glory to rest upon us, 1 Peter 4:14. Death shall stop the bottle of tears and open the gate of paradise. A believer's dying day is his ascension day to glory. Hence it is the saints have put their afflictions in the inventory of their riches, Hebrews 11:26. Let's just find our place. Funny thing, lost our place. Foolish of me. So, I believe his dying day is his ascension day to glory. Hence it is the saints have put their affliction in the inventory of their riches, Hebrews 11:26. It's because, again, my edition doesn't match this one, but it has extra text. Themistocles, the Athenian statesman, being banished from his own country, grew afterwards in favour with the king of Egypt, whereupon he said, I had perished if I had not perished. So may a child of God say, if I had not been afflicted, I had been destroyed. If my health and estate had not been lost, my soul had been lost. 3. See then what encouragement here is to become godly. All things shall work for good. Oh, that this may induce the world to fall in love with religion. Can there be a greater lodestone to piety? Can anything more prevail with us to be good than this? All things shall work for our good. Religion is the true philosopher's stone that turns everything into gold. Take the sourest part of religion, the suffering part, and there is comfort in it. God sweetens suffering with joy. He candies our wormwood with sugar. Oh, how may this bribe us to godliness? Acquaint now thyself with God, and be at peace. Thereby good shall come unto thee. Job 22:21. No man did ever come off a loser by his acquaintance with God. By this good shall come unto you, abundance of good, the sweet distillations of grace, the hidden manna, yea, everything shall work for good. Oh, then get acquaintance with God and espouse his interest. Well, the first thing I noticed there is the strange mismatch of the text, which may come from different editions, but I wonder whether it's not that the PDF edition that I've got up from Monergism is in fact depending on a kind of modernised version, or slightly more modernised version, hence the removal of the example of Themistocles. The other thing that comes to my mind from that is, again, a desire to emphasise how difficulty is good for the Christian, because of course that's the great comfort he wants to give with the entire book. He wants to say that poverty starves sins, sickness makes grace more helpful, that sort of thing. If I hadn't, and this is where Themistocles comes in, as he says, I would have perished if I had not perished. If I hadn't borne disgrace, I wouldn't have gained this great benefit of becoming the favourite of the king. The other thing is that idea of there are secondary causes in the world. There are the councils of men, there are stars and planets, there is kingdoms and lords decide things, natural laws, physics, but ultimately all those things are determined by divine providence. We see by the mention of stars and planets how thoroughly medieval in some ways the Puritans were, that their worldview was still significantly a pre-modern one as to their vision of the world, which is one reason why they can see glory in it rather than merely terror. But ultimately, whatever the cause, and even when we say, well, what about all the terror I see in the sky? It's beautiful, but it's meaningless, and there's supernovas and black holes. Ultimately, all these things are providentially ordered by God for the good of the saints. Indeed, the whole of creation is a theatre of his kindness, his glory and his kindness to us. So now back to Romans 1. We're Romans 1, 18 to 32. I'll read that out. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world and the things that have been made. So they are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honour him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. Therefore God gave them up in the lusts of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonouring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed for ever. Amen. For this reason God gave them up to dishonourable passions. For their women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature, and the men likewise gave up natural relations with women, and were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts with men, and receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error. And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind, to do what ought not to be done. They were filled with all manner of unrighteousness, evil, covetousness, malice. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, maliciousness. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, foolish, faithful, heartless, ruthless. Though they knew God's righteous decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but give approval to those who practice them. So Paul summed up the gospel very briefly in last week's reading, verses 16 to 17, and now he begins to show the need for the good news of God, or Jesus Christ. So let's consider verses 16 to 18 together. I'll read them together so we can see Paul's argument, how it develops. For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith for faith, as it's written, the righteous shall live by faith. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. So the good news is that the faithful believer can acquire God's righteousness through their very faith, not their works. The righteous shall live by faith. This is then being contrasted with something else. For often means because, and it has that connotation here to a degree, but it can also be used to demonstrate a contrast or juxtaposition. The righteous shall live by faith, but, or on the other hand, God's wrath is revealed against unrighteousness. The righteous shall live by faith and can only live by faith because the qualities outlined in verses 16 to 18 that relate to God and man are completely incompatible. There is the righteousness of God, verse 17. There is the ungodliness and unrighteousness of man. Therefore, there is the wrath of God revealed from heaven. That's verse 18. Mankind is here typified by unrighteousness and unholiness. Though Paul does not yet explicitly say that all people sin, he will say that later, he is drawing a contrast between God and man, and this contrast is centered on who is righteous. He doesn't say God is righteous, some men are unrighteous. He just says God is righteous, whereas he's angry at the unrighteousness of men. God is righteous, man is not. Therefore, for a human being to be righteous, they must somehow acquire the righteousness of God, which, verse 16, is the power of God to salvation, for salvation to everyone who believes. Paul does not merely state the fact of the matter, that God is wrathful against unrighteousness. He wants to impress upon the Romans the force of the problem. He wants them to know how great a salvation they have if they have faith. Paul's point in this portion is to demonstrate the sinful habits of Gentiles, those who are not Jewish. He will deal with the standing of the Jewish people in the next chapter. Here Paul wants to demonstrate that God is right to be wrathful against Gentiles. It's an important point to demonstrate because a natural complaint against the idea of pervasive human sinfulness is, well, if God hasn't told us what to do or hasn't revealed himself, how can he expect us to do things that would please him? The general modern version of this is about people who have never heard about the Christian God. They've never heard the gospel. How can they be held guilty for not worshipping him? Paris Reedhead tells the story, doesn't he, in 10 Shekels and a Shirt. He says, well, I wanted to go to help the poor heathen who had never heard of God. And then I got there and I found out that they knew what they needed to know. They just love sin. He was patronising them by thinking they didn't know anything, whereas they knew everything they needed to know about God. So it would seem very unfair for God to hold people responsible for crimes they didn't know were crimes. And Paul's anticipated this question 2,000 years ago. He wants to be clear about the absolute need for the gospel. He wants to establish the total depravity of mankind. And to do so, he must handle, when it comes to Gentiles, the potential objection that they had no access to revelation from God. Even so, he's going to argue they are guilty. He is arguing that they are guilty. On what basis? Well, he offers two arguments, which one develops from the other. The second two-thirds of the passage may seem less connected to the central point. They are, for Paul, a proof of human sin and also a rhetorical strengthening of his argument for the necessity of the gospel. So the first third is an argument, the second third is an argument, and they connect with the second two-thirds, developing from the first third. First, though, this is Paul's central argument. The Gentiles, whether they're Germanic tribesmen or Egyptian pharaohs or people Paul had never heard of, the Mesoamericans who were in Central America, Southern America before the Maya, they're all Gentiles everywhere. They could know everything they needed to know about God in order to fear him, but instead, nonetheless, did not do so, and instead did not honour him. And interestingly, Paul argues that every Gentile, whether an educated Greek or an uneducated Scythian, he's already mentioned the two groups, the barbarian and the Greek, could intuit certain of God's essential attributes merely by looking at the things that have been made. You can look at the stars in their order, you can look at the lofty mountain grandeur, and know about God's eternal power and divine nature. That's verse 20. That means really not just that a Gentile could guess there might be some sort of deity, but could turn their God-given reason to understanding that there must be something like the Christian God. They would then be able to deduce what God required for righteousness. Matters of high theology are available to everyone in nature, and there is no excuse, Paul says, not to know them. Now, it should be said, Paul is not saying anyone can be saved from sin by what is technically called, the technical word for this is natural theology, technical phrase. He doesn't mean anyone can look at the stars and receive forgiveness for sins because they realise there must be a God. He doesn't mean there's an intellectual act someone could do in nature without revelation and without grace that could save them. Paul is addressing the way we get into damning sin. For Gentiles, for anyone who hasn't been told about the true God, this consists of ignoring the evidence God has provided in nature. And the second proof is something that happens due to the first proof. And this starts really almost from verse 22. There is enough evidence in nature of God to discern his existence, but people ignore that. Therefore their hearts were darkened, verse 22. And verse 23 and 24 show us the basic version of this proof. So first, there is enough in nature to know God, but we ignore it. Second, our hearts are darkened and we sin. That is a proof of our sin, that we sin, obviously. Humans worshipping statues of humans, or worshipping animal-headed gods as the Egyptians did, is itself a proof of the moral corruption of humanity. They knew enough about God that they could replace him with his creations, with ridiculous idols who could not help them. It wasn't ignorance that led them there. It wasn't that people were making a good bet on what kind of God there might be when they had a beetle-headed God. It wasn't that they came up with an admirable system of philosophy while waiting to hear from God. They looked at nature, which showed such order and majesty and design and meaning. They looked at animals, they looked at vultures and beetles and cows and everything else, and they thought, great, let's make gods with vulture heads, or whatever else. And this is, Paul says, a lie. It's not a mistake, but a lie. And we can see the fruit of this decision to lie about the evidence of their eyes and their reason in people's behaviour. Notably, for the next 7 verses pretty much, Paul's biggest... he lists a whole number of sins which God gave them up to, but the most detailed section which is verses 26 and 27, the only thing where he gives more than kind of a quarter of a verse to it is sexual behaviour, sexual sin. And this isn't prudishness on Paul's part. He's not like, well, I don't like that stuff, it's gross, so it must be sin. His argument here is relying on the idea that unnatural, ridiculous or disgusting behaviour is a proof of corrupted morals, not mere ignorance. People going against what's plainly natural is not a proof of ignorance, but depravity. Which is different. We might read this and think, oh, he's just saying the things that, God has an arbitrary list of sins and this is the kind of example of what they might include. Arbitrary, but it's what God doesn't like. But his point is that we look at nature. In our natural theology, we know there must be a God. We know we can use our brains if we wanted, but we instead do things that are unnatural and bad, and that itself is a proof of our rebellion. So though Paul lists envy, murder, deceit and everything else in verses 29 to 30, and indeed 31, he focuses on the sins of the body first and in most detail, of basic anatomy and ordinary biological practice to prove that there is a moral law in nature, and that we choose to ignore it, and therefore choose to ignore God. But it will not have escaped notice that it doesn't just say that people who have rejected God do wicked things as a matter of course. It says 3 times, verses 24, 26, 28, that God gave them up in the lusts of their hearts to impurity, up to dishonourable passions, and to a debased mind to do what ought not to be done. Humans reject God because they exchange the truth about God for a lie, verse 25, and since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, verse 28, and so God gives them up to the natural results of such defiance. As it says, they receive in themselves the due penalty for their error. Is this merely passive on God's part? Is this merely a permission to sin? It might be comforting in a way to think so, because that separates God from what happens in sin. But we must see that this is God's will. He doesn't create the sin, but God gave them up, is the initiating fact or verb in these three subsections. He could have prevented such depravity by supernatural restraint. He chooses to let these rebels instead suffer the consequences of their knowing rejection of him. The first consequence is that their intellectual and spiritual sin finds a physical counterpart. You know, what's bred in the bone comes out in the flesh. The seed leads to a flower. They're connected. It's not that God makes them do these things, but rather than restraining that sin, he gives them up to it. And finally, in verse 32, we see that these depravities neither completely destroy the conscience of the rebellious Gentile, nor do they engender a self-directed repentance. Though they know, it says, God's righteous decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but give approval to those who practice them. No one is unaware, to give a modern example, that abortion is murder, or that dressing a little boy up as a drag queen is an abomination and child abuse. We know that, but people do it anyway, and some people vigorously defend others who do so. Of course, just because you're free from those sins doesn't mean you're free from sin. But as an example of obvious things that are obviously wrong, people both do them and support them. There is no self-directed repentance, despite the fact that there is still a conscience that knows those things are wrong. This is the grim news for the Gentiles. This is the grim news that has required the gospel. Paul is starting with why we need it. He sums it up. It's righteousness, it's salvation, that's the gospel. But then he says why. And because of this awful fate that the Gentiles have got themselves into. Where does it lead to? We'll see next week. Yeah, see you then.